1990s, a surprise hit on the WB network was the show Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Do you remember Buffy the Vampire Slayer? Viewers of a certain age will. There was Sarah Michelle Gellar, who starred as the title character Buffy Summers, who seemed to be a ditzy cheerleader by day, but was actually a super smart, super talented, super martial arts practicing vampire slayer by night. If you watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you know that vampires weren't just things she slayed. There were characters, particularly the character of Angel, who were vampires that seemed like they were going to be foes, but then turned into love interests. Now, I know too much about Buffy the Vampire Slayer lore, and I won't bore you with it. I'll just summarize it. Angel was a vampire who's over 100 years old. He was an evil, scourge of humanity for many, many decades after he became a vampire, until he was cursed with a soul. Now, how could a vampire have a soul if he's an undead fiend? Well, I'll spare you the details. Anyway, he ends up having a soul, which means he now has a conscience. He now has remorse for the evil he did in the past, and he wants to make amends and help the helpless. And he and Buffy Summers run into each other. She's a girl who's sworn to hate vampires because they're evil. He's a vampire who turns out not to be so evil, and they fall in love unexpectedly. In the third season of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, many things have happened, including Buffy and Angel have tried to make it work as boyfriend and girlfriend. It goes horribly wrong, and now they've decided they can't be together, but then they have to figure out, how can we just be friends? And a couple episodes into season 3, there's a episode about Buffy's birthday. And Buffy lives in a cute suburban bungalow in a 90s California style, whereas Angel lives up on the hill in a, kind of dilapidated mansion and broods, and he's sophisticated. He's a vampire from the 19th century. And so it's Buffy's birthday, and she goes to see Angel, and Angel, who can't give her his love, gives her instead a book. And that book is the 1850 sonnet collection by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Sonnets from the Portuguese. Now, when I first watched this episode many years ago, I wasn't very familiar with Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And I thought to myself, well, this is kind of a cheesy attempt to seem sophisticated. But the more I got to know Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets, especially the first of those sonnets, I began to think that the writers of Buffy the Vampire Slayer were pretty darn clever. Let me read you the first sonnet in this collection. This collection, Sonnets from the Portuguese, was written kind of in secret by Elizabeth Barrett as she was being courted by the famous poet Robert Browning. Elizabeth Barrett would become Elizabeth Barrett Browning, they would get married, and she would become just as famous as him in her own right. But when she was writing these sonnets, she wasn't as famous as him. She had published some poetry, got some notoriety, but he was seen as kind of the next Wordsworth, one of the most important living writers, maybe one of the greatest in all of English history. Apparently, he had mentioned to her, I think this was back in about 1846, that he didn't think ladies could or should write sonnets. And, he was critical of any woman who would try and write sonnets. That's for the men, of course. Well, she started writing sonnets about him. And a couple of years after they got married, after the birth of their first child, she gives him this collection of 44 sonnets. And she was like, oh, by the way, while we were recording, I wrote all these sonnets. Robert Browning, to his credit, read them and said, my goodness, this is the greatest collection of sonnets since Shakespeare. Let's publish it. I was wrong. So, good on him for learning. But I want to read you the first of these sonnets. I thought once how Theocritus had sung of the sweet years, the dear and wished-for years, who each one in a gracious hand appears to bear a gift for mortals, old or young. And as I mused it in his antique tongue, I saw in gradual vision through my tears the sweet sad years, the melancholy years, those of mine own life, who by turns had flung a shadow across me. Straightway I was ware, so weeping, how a mystic shape did move behind me, and drew me backward by the hair. And a voice said in mastery while I strove, Guess now who holds thee. Death, I said. But there the silver answer rang, not death, but love. Not death, but love. This is a sonnet of 14 lines, of course. It has a sung years, appears young, tongue, tears, years, flung, where, move, hair, strove, there, love, rhyme schemes, ABBA, and then we have a C, D, C, D, C, D, sestet. She cheats a little bit. She has years twice, but they're pretty far apart from each other. And, she can do what she wants. She's Elizabeth Barrett Browning. But, this is a sonnet that, I think we've talked about before on this channel. But it starts this sequence of sonnets that's going to end in the second to last with probably Browning's most famous sonnet, which is, How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, when feeling out of sight for the ends of being an ideal grace. It's this sort of ultimate statement of love. And at the end of that sonnet, she says, I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life. And if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. So it's this kind of ultimate, triumphant, I'm going to love you forever. The first sonnet, though, back 43 sonnets before that, is I'm dying, I'm old, I see the years pass, and this shadow comes behind me, and I'm like, yeah, it's time for me. It's time for me to go, isn't it? And I say, hey there, death. And the silver answer rings, not death, but love. So what does that have to do with Buffy the Vampire Slayer? Well, I think the writers knew what was going on in these sonnets and knew that this was spoken from the perspective of a character, particularly a woman, who feels that she is fated to die and fated to write of death, and who is surprised by love. Now, I think this applies to both the character of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel the Vampire. How? Well, Buffy is the one who's supposed to kill vampires. And vampires, because she's a vampire slayer, kill is not quite the right word. To slay a vampire, you stick a stake in their heart, or you cut off their head, or, make them drink holy water or something like that. And the vampire, who has no soul, he's just sort of a body controlled by a, evil spirit. The body just melts away, it poofs into dust. This isn't, there's no blood when you kill a vampire, even though vampires suck blood. It's actually a very clean kill. Or slay, I should say, slayage. There's actually an academic journal about Buffy called Slayage. Buffy is the one who is supposed to end vampires. And so vampires will often, come after Buffy and try and kill her, and thus gain notoriety and, fame for being the slayer of the slayer. So in falling in love with a vampire, Buffy is enacting this Elizabeth Barrett character who expects in coming upon this presence, this other thing, to find only death, or at least the danger of death. But in Angel, she finds not someone who wants to kill her, but someone ultimately who loves her. I think this works pretty well for Buffy. And yet I think it actually works even better as something from Angel's perspective. Angel is a vampire who knows when he sees any slayer that she is the embodiment of his end. And in fact, if a slayer comes against you, you rightly are supposed to think, I'm in immediate danger of being slain. But Angel is surprised by finding love in Buffy, not death. And because Angel gives Buffy on her birthday sonnets from the Portuguese, I kind of like to think that we're supposed to think that it's Angel who's saying, my attitude toward you, Buffy, is the same as Elizabeth Barrett's attitude toward Robert. Or maybe Elizabeth Barrett speaker's attitude toward this shadow that comes over her. I think it's pretty cool that a 90s TV show would know and think about the sonnets of the 1800s and kind of hide this Easter egg for anyone who was looking. I don't know if I'm the only one who's read through Sonnets of the Portuguese after watching this Buffy episode. This Buffy episode is called Helpless, by the way, if you want to go find it. It's season 3, a few episodes into season 3. And the most of the episode is not about Sonnets from the Portuguese. It's actually about Buffy loses her powers because she's been poisoned. But then it turns out actually it's like this rite of passage that Slayers have to go through, and she has to prove her mettle, while her Slayer powers are gone. I don't know. It's not the best episode in the world, but the Sonnets from the Portuguese section is really cool. And if 90s TV shows are what it takes us to look at great sonnets like those of Elizabeth Barrett Browning in the 1800s, then I say it's well worth it.